Hello, can you all hear us now?
Yep.
Wonderful. Thank you all for joining us today. We are greatly honored to have our last M-Room be hosted for the semester to be hosted by our wonderful senior Mericel, our OMA ambassador, who we love so much. We are so grateful she's joining us to talk about mass incarceration and criminal justice system here in the U.S. So, thank you, Mericel.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mericel Mirabal. I'm a senior, so I will be graduating in a few weeks. And I'm a double major in sociology and Latin American and Latinx studies with a minor in Africana studies and a certificate in the global citizenship program. So the reason why I'm doing this project is because I actually did it as a part of my capstone for the global citizenship program. And for my capstone, we kind of just had to identify like what was an area of learning that we didn't feel like we really received within our like college education here at Lehigh. And for me, that gap was primarily within like mass incarceration and the criminal justice system, because I barely had learned about it. And I figured that it would be something that would be important for my future career within law and policy, especially as it disproportionately affects poor people of color, which are the communities that I'm most interested in helping. So today, this real talk is primarily just going to be me presenting some of the facts that I found throughout that research, and then asking some discussion questions that'll hopefully get y'all thinking more about this subject. So I'll move on to the first slide, which is what do you know about mass incarceration already? So anyone can feel free to jump in about this.
What is your definition of mass incarceration?
I honestly would just give whatever you think it is. This is more of just a question trying to see like what your definition is, or what you already know about mass incarceration.
Well, I know that about the only thing I really know is that if you take percentage of population, the United States has the highest percentage of its citizens incarcerated in the whole world. And that's about all I know. And maybe that's not right. I don't know.
No, you are, and you are correct.
No.
Okay.
Mass incarceration is caused because of a lot of factors, like such as redlining and other systemic issues that allow specifically like minorities to be put in prison for typically pretty petty crimes.
Thank you for sharing.
I was going to say, I think from my perspective, mass incarceration seems to be a policy solution for how the US government controls folks of color, low income folks, poor folks, people with mental health challenges.
Thank you for sharing, Jen.
I think in addition to some of the disproportionality people are talking about, also the recognition that the prison industry is an industry that makes lots and lots of money for lots of companies and not necessarily people.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing.
I would talk about like the mass incarceration, in my opinion, largely stemmed from the war on drugs that has been in place for decades, and incarcerating and increasingly incarcerating individuals for possession of drugs, treating drug addiction as a criminal issue rather than a public health issue. Sentencing guidelines for crack cocaine versus powder cocaine, like so many disparities in there. I mean, and the list can go on and on, but I also think it's, society's criminalization of behaviors. And as somebody mentioned, redlining, and I think that's a good example, but one of many examples of ways we have criminalized or adopted policies that have reduced opportunities for large segments of our society that tend to push people towards criminalization and then towards activities that have become criminalized. And even, drug-related offenses, prostitution-related offenses, and the list kind of goes on and on, which have led to, 3 strikes you're out policies that have led to, extreme sentences for just repeat low-level offenses. And we seem to have all the money in the world to incarcerate, yet we didn't have the money to treat people properly to begin with.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So I'll just start off with a little introduction on mass incarceration. Mass incarceration refers to the United States being the leading country in incarceration and prison population. America's approach to punishment lacks a public safety rationale, disproportionately affects minorities, and inflicts harsh sentences, which many of these are things that you all mentioned, so thank you for that. And currently, almost 2.5 million people are in carceral control here in the United States. There are 1,833 state prisons, 110 federal prisons, 1,772 juvenile correctional facilities, 3,134 local jails, 218 immigration detention facilities, and 80 Indian country jails. And as someone mentioned earlier, we do have the highest incarceration rate in the world. And so I guess this leads to my next question. How does America have the highest incarceration rate in the world?
Well, I think if we have, as the guy right before me said, strict guidelines for what some consider petty crimes, then we're going to have a higher incarceration rate.
Thank you.
I know like America has a pretty long history of incarcerating for, like previous people have said, petty crimes. And I was watching a documentary called The 13th, and there's actually a loophole in the 13th amendment in the Constitution that says that slavery is illegal unless the people are in prison. So like at that point, people were in prison for like little things like jaywalking, or like little petty crimes, and that has really not been like solved or like fixed in the past 100 years since that's been implemented. And you could definitely see it like continue to happen, like the war on drugs, or like how many things are just constantly criminalized, especially in people of color, like Black and brown communities. So that's like a huge aspect of it.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Ray. I'll also be talking about the legacies of slavery that exist within mass incarceration and excessive punishment as well.
In the last 40 years or so, it's been exacerbated by our two-party political system, which obviously has always been in place, but the need for those two parties to one-up each other when it comes to issues of safety, crime, being tough on crime is absolutely required of any politician. And because there are only two parties, there's a lack of additional voices that could potentially advocate for, say, restorative justice methods, or anything other than sweeping people off the streets and putting them in incarceration. So you have that, and then you have what in the 80s started as the sensational media landscape, which also exacerbates this perception, and the media completely underscores this perception that people of color are disproportionately responsible for all crimes, and all of these things that get ingrained into the national landscape and reinforce then the systems that are in place, and actually strengthen the systems that are in place to get the quote bad people out of our sights and into incarceration.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that perspective in. So this is just a breakdown of what I was talking about earlier about the how the US locks up more people per capita than any other nation. So it's a breakdown of how many people are in state prisons, local jails, federal prisons and jails, and how many of those are in youth correctional facilities and immigration detention centers, and so on and so forth, and how many or the proportion of those crimes that are robberies, assaults, driving under the influence, et cetera, et cetera. And moving back onto what Ray was talking about a little bit earlier, how is slavery connected to mass incarceration and excessive punishment? So in 1664, the General Assembly of Maryland said that all Black people shall serve durante vita, meaning that they should be performing hard labor for life. They sustained this throughout the threat of brutal punishment, and slavery denied the humanity of Black people, but still criminalized their actions. So in 1861, the Supreme Court of Alabama explained that enslaved Black people were capable of committing crimes, and only then they shall be regarded as a person. So only in this form were they seen as people in general. And although slavery was legally abolished with the 13th Amendment, this system still continued for those seen as criminals, and Black people went from being seen as slaves to criminals. Therefore, mass incarceration and excessive punishment became legacies of slavery. And this is some more basic information. 96,000 of those imprisoned reside in Pennsylvania. Over 555,000 are locked up before being convicted or sentenced. Prisons rely on the labor of incarcerated people for food service, laundry, and other operations, but they're paid roughly $86 to $3.45 per day for the most common jobs, and some states actually pay nothing at all. Few of them have rights and protections that are afforded to them, and most people in prison are poor. The poorest are women and people of color, and Black people are overrepresented in prisons. And another 840,000 people are on parole, and 3.6 million are on probation. So some of these statistics we've already mentioned before, but are there any that are surprising to y'all, or any that anyone else wants to bring up here?
The one, the last dot says Black people are overrepresented in prisons. Are you suggesting, I hear this all the time, are we suggesting that there should be like a mathematical one-to-one correspondence? Like the percentage of Black population should be the percentage of Black people in prison? Is that what we're getting at there?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I was about to say, I don't. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
No, please finish your point. Yeah, I was just gonna say, I don't know if it's one-to-one in regards to population. I think the larger point is, if you look at the fact that Black folks only make up 12% of the population, but are extremely overrepresented, almost at 50% of the prison population, that's not a coincidence, right? And I think that was Ray's point as we move from slavery to incarceration, that slavery still exists, it just looks differently.
Well, okay, so what I'm getting at is, if the population is 12% Black, are you suggesting that there should only be about 12% of incarcerated people that are Black?
No, again, we're not suggesting that there's a one-on-one population, but what we are saying is that 50% of the population of incarcerated being Black, and only 12% of the population is not a coincidence. Okay. And it's not because Black folks commit more crime than anybody else, because that's not true either.
I feel like
Thank you.
Also you have to look at this like holistically. Like, these are statistics, but they have no explanation behind them. So it's kind of like Chad was mentioning, like Black people only make up 12% of population, yet 50% of all the people in the prison industrial complex. And it's not because like Black people commit more crimes, it's because they get convicted for crimes more often than their white peers. And I think that's the issue that will probably be spoken about like further into the presentation. That's something like we should all think about.
So I would also, I would agree with that completely. And I would say on top of that, it's not just conviction rates. I think the systemic issues go far deeper than the surface level of our criminal justice system. Certainly, sentencing for Black citizens has been greater sentences than for white citizens committing the same crimes. But if you look into, I mentioned before, like banking, getting loans, getting jobs, the discrimination throughout our society, reducing, opportunities that non-Black people have had, has placed many people in situations where our society has criminalized behavior that people have been forced into. It's a much more systemic issue than I think one level. It's so many multiple variables that can account to getting to this 50% level. I don't think you can just look at one level and say this is because of that one thing. There's just so many layers of issues. So that's it.
Yeah, I also agree with that in that, like, in my experience has been more with the school system. You see Black kids being suspended, expelled, punished for the same incidents, and actually more severely than their white peers, and the implications that has, like, over the long term in terms of it being impacting able to apply to colleges, or being able to secure other opportunities for themselves. So yes, on a systemic level, this does not start as adults. Even when you see those percentages for the youth incarceration, like this starts from when kids are very young as well.
Yeah, and I appreciate adding that context to like what Chad was saying, because as a psychologist and a researcher, you see numbers statistically that are outside that like normal range. It doesn't necessarily mean, okay, that means we should have this percentage of this identity in a prison, but it makes you look, like Chad said, like what is going on here? What other things might be influencing this discrepancy that we should be seeing based on like statistics of our society?
Thank you all for that. I hope that clarified a little bit about that question. So my next question is, why are people of color disproportionately incarcerated? Which I think we've been getting at a little bit.
I'll throw one out there just from personal experience, having, watching bail assessments for someone who has already been charged with a crime. Your likelihood of being incarcerated, a bail assessment is looking for ties to a community, steady job. Do you own or do you rent, or are you staying with somebody? And the list goes on. There's a specific list of questions that are asked, but I think you could look at an underlying factor in every one of the questions that's asked, and some things could be revealed as to like, why is a certain person in the situation that they are? And if they don't have that steady job, a tie to a community, and they're much more likely to have a high bail assessed and more likely to be incarcerated pre-conviction than many other individuals. And I think, like what I've been talking about before, about some other systemic racist elements within our societies have placed Black people in a much higher likelihood of being incarcerated pre-conviction than others. And I think that's a big part. And then we look at prior offenses for whether it's sentencing guidelines or bail assessments, and when we have criminalized behavior, and started back right after the passage of the 13th Amendment with a lot of places, communities and states in the South criminalizing behavior for Black people, to take a part of that loophole that was pointed out in the 13th Amendment and put sentenced Black individuals back at work on plantations because they could. It was legal, so we criminalized what was previously non-criminal behavior in order to put the labor back where they wanted it. So, and not much has changed. I mean, you know, some of the facts have changed, but that underlying those factors still are in play.
Do we have reliable data on how much that occurred after the passing of the 13th Amendment? I saw the documentary, and one could get the impression that all former slaves immediately became present day prisoners. Do we have any idea of how, you know, what percentage of former slaves were incarcerated?
I mean, personally, for this project, I didn't look up that type of data, but I'm not sure if anyone else has like any information to contribute to that question.
I'm not sure about like the specific percentage, but like using a little bit of like a little bit of logic, like slaves in the South at that time were their biggest source of income. Like it was free labor essentially. So when you look at like the loophole in the 13th Amendment and like the repercussions that it had, like logically speaking, like it's no coincidence that like Black people were overrepresented in the prison population from the time of the 13th Amendment. So like, I don't know, like a little critical thinking like in the matter could possibly like, you know, explain that.
Thank you, Ray.
I think too, in addition to the under-resourced piece that you're talking about, Jason, which feels really tied to that, like folks who are previously enslaved now don't have resources, money, housing. Police departments are created to literally catch, right, formerly enslaved folks. I think there's also currently this like dehumanization of Black and brown folks in our country that happens that makes it easier to disproportionately sentence, disproportionately charge folks to a prison sentence. I was even looking at that first graph you showed of like the percentage of Black and brown folks who are incarcerated, and like such a large portion of the state imprisonment was actually violence, not drugs. And that like perfectly ties into the dehumanization stereotype of like the violent Black man and what that looks like. I think about the parallel of Brock Turner being given the benefit of the doubt, being given support, being given he has such a bright future, to looking at how George Floyd was represented after his murder. Well, here's this petty crime that happened. Let's see how we can dehumanize him. And it really like frees us, I think, a little bit as a country from guilt or like shame that we'd have to sit with if we were thinking about like what we were actually doing here.
I really like that point that you made. Like, I feel like whenever Black people specifically are victims of police brutality, it's always like the media and like the general population's like immediate response to like find their entire criminal history instead of like to justify the means of why it happened. And to answer like this question a little bit, I feel like it was mentioned previously, but like poverty and scarcity breed crime. And obviously like those are social economic issues that are like intertwined with race. So if like you take away the wealth from entire like group of people and you put them in these like section off neighborhoods with redlining, obviously there's going to be higher crime rate. They're going to put more police. And I think you also touched on this previously, like the police system wasn't created until after the 13th Amendment was passed. So it's like the police were created to round up Black people specifically. So that's another issue that like had arisen.
Thank you all for sharing.
I think the origins of police forces were like to crack up unions, and they were, you know, pro corporation, from what I've read about the beginning of policing in America.
I think you could actually like look this up, that for the specifically in the South, like I know I've taken Texas history because that's where I'm from, and I know that police unions in Texas were specifically like derived from slave catching like patrols or whatnot. So like it's based off like your geography, like where you're from.
Okay, so now we're gonna watch a short video that's gonna talk a little bit more about mass incarceration.
The rate of incarceration is so high, so socially
Can you all hear it?
concentrated, that we're no longer incarcerating the individual, but we're incarcerating whole social groups. The rate of incarceration now is about 5 times higher than it was historically. Historically, it was 100 per 100,000. Now it's about 500 per 100,000. If we look at prison, if we add jail to that, it's about 700 per 100,000. Nowhere in the world incarcerates as much as we do. We've seen extremely high rates of exposure to the criminal justice system for African American men with very low levels of schooling. So if we think about black men who were born in the late 1970s and who are growing up through the American prison boom of the 1980s and the 1990s, the chances that they're going to serve time in state or federal prison if they dropped out of high school is about 70%. So going to prison for that group of black men with very low levels of schooling, that's become a normal life event. And that's really only happened in the last 10 years. We're at this point now where there's about 1.2 million African American children with a parent who's incarcerated. That's about 1 in 9. The research shows the kids who experience parental incarceration have diminished school achievement, they have behavioural problems, depressive symptoms, acting out. And there's also evidence that these kinds of negative effects associated with parental incarceration are concentrated more among boys than among girls. And there's a very real risk here that incarceration becomes an inherited trait. The underlying issue is we've chosen prison as a way to respond to that problem of crime. And there are a whole variety of ways that we could have chosen to respond to that problem of crime. We've chosen the response of the deprivation of liberty. And we've chosen the response of the deprivation of liberty for a historically aggrieved group whose liberty in the United States was never firmly established to begin with.
Are there any thoughts or reactions to that video that anyone wants to share?
I guess first reaction is just, it's not just behaviors or strict behaviors or certain behaviors that are criminalized, but blackness is criminalized, right? We have to understand that so that you can exist as a black person, follow all the rules, have a good job, live in a good neighborhood, and find yourself in prison because you are a target of sort of the front-facing end of the criminal justice system, which would be the police.
I really like that point because far too many times like we see people getting like penalized for crimes that they did not commit just because they fit a vague description of another person. And with this video specifically, like it kind of like resonates with me because like I was one of those children. Like my father was in prison for like a couple of years, and like but like luckily like I, instead of taking that, like being one of those statistics, like I took that opportunity to like learn more about the prison industrial complex and like educate myself on the matters instead of like being angry at what's happening.
I think I also really appreciated that this video brought into perspective how many how students are affected by the system and how like the percentages of students that end up dropping out and then are like basically turn away into like the prison system. And I'll be talking a little bit more about like the school to prison pipeline and how that exactly works, and how students of color and poor students are like disciplined more because of this system existing already. Oh, no, you went back. So just to talk a little bit more about some of the other injustices within the criminal justice system, there are 5.2 million Americans that are barred from voting due to felony disenfranchisement laws. African Americans are more likely than white Americans to be arrested. Once arrested, they are more likely to be convicted, and once convicted, they are more likely to experience lengthy prison sentences. African American adults are 5.9 times more than likely to be incarcerated than white adults, and Hispanics are 3.1 times more likely than white adults. Of the 277,000 people in prison nationwide for drug offenses, over half, around 56%, are African American or Latino. And of the 206,000 people serving life or virtual life sentences, 48% are African American and 15% are Latino. And then of the mandatory minimums first enacted for drug-related offenses and heavily used during the drug on wars era. And prosecutors bring mandatory minimum 65% more often against Black defendants, which results in Black individuals serving more time than white individuals for the exact same crimes. And I think someone put something in the chat. Something about the new Jim Crow laws. But do any of these statistics surprise you all, or were these all things that you were aware of? I think a few of them were already mentioned about how Black people are more likely to be arrested, and once arrested, they're more likely to be convicted and experience like lengthy prison sentences. But yeah.
Look at this and just shows you how through the entire system, right, from being targeted interaction with police to being round up to just get in front of a judge to being sentenced to being getting inside to the fact that there no longer exists now any kind of rehabilitation programs and education programs, and like the entire system is set to house Black folk, brown folk, poor folk, women of color, and those, again, difference, and in particular Blackness, is criminalized from the beginning to the end.
Now-
I also found whoever just spoke, you can go.
Chad, I wonder, given Justice Alito's twisted rationale of history and relying on history, since there was no historical guarantee of abortion, does that mean that somebody like Kim could look at no historical guarantee of freedom in this country? Therefore, the historical guarantee was you're a slave. And is that what we have to look forward to down the road? I don't think it's much of a stretch. If you're willing to take away freedoms that have been guaranteed, whether you agree with it, abortion or not, if you're willing to take away freedoms that have been guaranteed, and you're looking at history, can that be far behind with those justices?
I don't know if I get the fullness of your question, Rob. I think at the end of the day, what we are looking at is the fact that this country was made for cisgender white men of a certain class, right? And the further away you get from that identity, the more criminalized, the more threatening the more your life is at danger. That was true yesterday, that is even true today.
Truly.
Robert, I think you make an excellent point. And, it's studying Supreme Court cases, I'm extremely concerned about that. I mean, I was going to call it a strained rationale, but it's a twisted rationale and, a perversion of what our history has been and some of the basis for at least this draft opinion that has been leaked. And I see exactly what you're saying. And what I think is the most dangerous thing is that if that opinion moves from a draft stage to the adoption by the majority of the Supreme Court, now that becomes a precedent that could be used for future decisions to stand on for the oppression of any number of marginalized groups that those in the majority would want to take that out on. So I think the danger is extreme. Yeah, I hear your point.
On bullet point, the last prosecutors bring mandatory minimum 65% more. I'm curious what the prosecutorial community, how they address that when confronted. Like, what do they say? What is the reasoning behind that?
Yeah,
Anybody?
Sorry,
go ahead.
I can speak to some of that, and not, I'm not a prosecutor, in district attorney's office, but I've worked very closely with them. And there's state guidelines in legislation that they'll use, like a scoring system, and a lot of it is prior conduct, prior convictions, and as a criminal defendant has a score assigned to them, and the guidelines that prosecutors will follow will increase the recommendations just based on someone's priors. But if someone's priors are based on flawed convictions or flawed prosecutions or arrests, you can see how one just builds on the other, and next thing you know, you have prosecutors bringing those mandatory minimum sentences or recommending those at a higher rate, because of this scoring system. And perhaps instead of looking at like what's before them right now with this individual with this crime, our society tends to build punishment for past crimes.
So in other words, it's back to no good deed goes unpunished. So even though you were convicted and you paid the price, whatever the court's punishment was, whatever it was adjudicated, and you served it, but now you must continue to pay. It's like a student loan that never goes away.
And then for a lot of people, the top point, but disenfranchisement, and the complete inability to even begin to elect people who have a different opinion, just removing them from the entire electorate.
I want to add back to one of the slides that was presented in terms of the alternatives that were presented in the videos, that there are a great number of people that struggle with mental health issues, that struggle with alcoholism or drug abuse. And, this impacts a lot of people overall. And I think there is evidence to back this up. Overwhelmingly, the amount of people that we see in drug rehabilitations, in psychiatric units, are white. Oftentimes, prisons does serve as a placeholder for not just people with mental illness, but people of color with mental illness. And so thinking about that yes, there are alternatives, but who also benefits from these alternatives? Are people of color allowed to have concerns and issues like the rest of everyone without being punished so severely and incarcerated? I've personally I come from the South, I come from the state of Florida, and I've seen individuals, white individuals who've committed serious offenses, such as stealing, including drugs in universities, at the university, selling drugs, and be transferred straight into a rehabilitation without necessarily being charged or convicted to this extent. Not to say that this is a singular example, but it is not unusual for those stories and for white individuals to have opportunities to attend rehabs and rehabilitate, rather than being arrested and charged and convicted to this extent.
Sorry, I feel like I'm saying way too much. Sorry about that. But yeah, that's an excellent point. And I can't not take the opportunity to point out what I think is one of our biggest injustices is our healthcare system that's for profit. I believe the for-profit medicine has an unbelievably racist impact on this country. And when you think about how most of our population in this country has their medical and healthcare and mental health care benefits tied to employment. And, again, how things just stack upon one another. And those in marginalized communities are much less likely to have the type of healthcare benefits to be able to get mental health care or rehabilitation care. And we revert to a criminal justice system to quote unquote treat, which we don't in that system, those who don't have the ability to get actual help.
Yeah, and I appreciate y'all for bringing the discussion of mental health into this as well. And later in the presentation, I'll be talking about some of like the prison alternatives that exist that do try to incorporate more of like the mental health aspect. But I did want to go back to discussing like the mandatory minimums. On the next slide, I do have a short video that it'll talk about what mandatory minimums are.
This is mandatory minimums in 60 seconds. Let's rewind to the 1970s. US crime was rising dramatically and policymakers wanted to do something. Mandatory minimum laws seemed like a good idea. Everyone who committed the same crime would have the same guaranteed sentence. Parole was limited and flexibility was taken from judges. Sentences would always be fair and politicians could get tough on crime. Everybody's happy, right? Well, no, not really. In the 1980s, Congress started creating mandatory sentences for all sorts of crimes, including drug offenses, and the federal prison population exploded. And the states weren't much better. California passed some of the most notorious mandatory sentences, and its prison population soared. We all want to be safe, but automatically locking up nonviolent people for years won't get us there. Think about this 21-year-old in Florida. State law says he'll spend 3 years in prison. That doesn't make us safer. But there's a solution. Don't let politicians become judge, jury, and executioner. Let judges do their jobs and choose a fair sentence to fit each unique crime.
Were there any thoughts or reactions to this video about mandatory minimums? If not, I can move into a little bit more of the discussion on the school to prison pipeline that we mentioned earlier about how students of color and poor students are policed more and pushed out of their schools and into the criminal justice system. And as the first point says, that's what the practice essentially is, pushing students out of the schools and into the criminal justice system. And it primarily does affect low income, racially marginalized and disabled students. To discuss it a little bit more, with preschoolers, African Americans make up 18% of enrollment, yet they account for 42% of preschool suspensions. There are new zero tolerance policies that result in out of school suspensions, which created an explosion on the national suspension rates to 24.3% for Black students and 12% for Hispanic students. In the 2011 to 2012 school year, More than 3 million students were suspended from school, which doubled the level that occurred in 1974. And of these suspended children, 250,000 were referred to law enforcement officers. Black and Latino students are also suspended and expelled at a higher rate than white students. And research also shows that when young students are suspended or expelled from school, they are several times more likely to experience disciplinary action later in their academic career, drop out or fail out of school, report feeling disconnected from school, and be incarcerated later in life. So that leads me to my next question. Are you aware of this issue? Do you know how students are being disciplined in schools today? Have you seen this occurring recently?
I feel like I can kind of speak on this since like it wasn't too long ago that I was in high school. I think nowadays, like many teachers don't really know other alternative methods other than go to the principal's office, you're suspended, you're in suspension, like things of that nature. And kind of like what Chris was saying earlier, like there's a bunch of intersectionality in the matter. Like you don't know if they're going through like a mental health concern, you don't know if like they're having issues at home, like it's just the automatic like consequences. Oh, you're in trouble, like for something that, you know, you never know that what could be happening behind the scenes. And I feel like this kind of instills like in their mentality, like any little thing that you do, there's like harsh repercussions. And this is like not really helpful to you know, once again, the rehabilitation of, you know, behavioral actions.
I was a public school teacher during 2011. In fact, from 2003 to 2011, in a primarily BIPOC populated school in Philadelphia. It was a horrible time to try and be a teacher. It happened to be a time of no discipline allowed, meaning kids were running hallways, smoking weed in school. Parents, it was bedlam. And the attempted suspensions was a way to try and bring some law and order. And a big problem was that there was no restorative justice, there was no discipline before, and I was in a high school before the kids got there. So now you had 15-year-olds who had never had any amount of control running loose. Yeah, there were a lot of suspensions. There were a lot of safety issues. It's not, at that time, well, you would not have wanted to be there. That's all I can say.
I agree with your second point, where you mentioned like by the time they got to high school, because when you really think about it, this is a very systemic issue. Like schools would rather suspend students instead of spending a little extra money on like after school programs and different like extracurricular activities like that to keep students engaged like from a young age. And this also like goes back to like redlining. If you look at like the schools in more affluent neighborhoods, like they don't really experience these type of issues versus like inner city schools. Like I went to school in inner city Houston, Texas. Like it was experienced these same phenomenons. So like I was saying, mentioned, like it's a very systemic issue, like that no one's really willing to tackle from like the ground up. They're just willing to like give harsh consequences.
I would add, it doesn't have to be like an either or issue, whether like is there, whether you have like school suspension or you quote let kids run loose, which I'm not, to be honest, comfortable with that with that description. There can be firmness, you can set boundaries at the same time. And I think Tess put this in the comment about a trauma-informed approach. You know, you also have kids who've experienced severe form of trauma, and as school staff and teacher, are you contributing to this by also disciplining in such a way that adds to those trauma symptoms? So yes, kids need boundaries. Yes, there are rules that need to be implemented, but doing so in a fair and equitable manner, taking into consideration the context in which students are navigating, and humanizing all of these experiences that students are going through, which tends not to occur in some of these in what's called like inner city schools as well.
As you want consideration for the students, consider the teacher with 33 kids in the classroom. Are they supposed to be school psychologist, social worker, disciplinarian? Oh, also a teacher. So as we don't know all that's going on with the student, and there's a lot, think about all that then is piled on the teacher. Why don't they just spend a few more dollars? You mean in addition to the thousands the teachers have to pay out of their pocket now to bring supplies for their students? So I'm just saying, consider both sides. It's not a this side of the coin or that side of the coin solution.
So I think I'll speak as the son of a former Philadelphia school teacher who taught at Franklin and Gratz and West Philly, you know, and had, you know, students again. Franklin's a North Philly school, Gratz is a North Philly school, West Philly's at 48th and Walnut. So we aren't talking, you know, whatever we're talking about the neighborhoods. What I would say is that, and I think somebody said this really well, the human side of some of these kids, yes. Trust me, my father didn't believe in summer vacation. So I went to school with him when I was on vacation from my school. So I see him discipline kids, but even when he would discipline kids or take them out of the classroom or whatever, he did it with at least a level of humanity and respect. And again, I've traveled different places. I've met some of my father's former students, you know, working in different places, as far away as Florida, North Carolina. And that human treatment, again, my father was a very strict man, but he treated his kids, and yes, he had 30 kids in a classroom trying to teach them typing and so forth and so on. But he treated them with the same level of decency and respect, even when they're acting up. Because again, at the end of the day, they're just children. Children need boundaries, sure, but they're not fully responsible. So you treat them with the respect and you just move forward from there.
Circling back to the person who spoke before Jesse, I do agree with the point where like schools should be willing to spend a little more money on like certain psychologists and, you know, people to actually help students. But I also feel like like at the same time, like teachers should have the like compassion necessary, like kind of what Jesse was saying. And if like as a teacher, you should be able to have that. Like if you don't, then why are you a teacher? But like I also have been in those like situations myself. Like I've been in, not to make a baseless generalization, but I have been in predominantly BIPOC schools with Black teachers or teachers of color and white teachers in those school settings. And I can, like, once again, not to make a baseless generalization, but like you can definitely see the difference of like the compassion level with the students, because many of the BIPOC teachers have been in that similar predicament. So it's all about like, I feel like a really important thing is like promoting more teachers who have been in the same, like similar environments as the students is like a really big thing to kind of ensure that these type of issues won't really happen.
Well, I just want to say thank you all for bringing these points up to the discussion. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so we're not going to keep going, but I hope you all were able to take something away from this and we're able to enjoy or learn from these discussions that were had. I think that mass incarceration and the school to prison pipeline, along with the different criminal injustices, are things that we should continue to educate ourselves about, because it seems as though they're not going away anytime soon. So bringing in more awareness about these issues so that we can make better informed decisions in the future is definitely necessary. But yeah, I will most likely be sharing the slides to Renee after this. If any of y'all want to see where the statistics are coming from and whatnot, I would be happy to do so.
Thank you so much, Mericel. This was very informative. Yes, I know we didn't even get to like half of what you wanted to show us, but thank you. And thank you all for your discussions and your viewpoints and perspectives. We definitely look forward to talking to you more. We are going to have some summer sessions as well. Not as frequent, not weekly, but we will be sending invitations out when they do occur. We're trying every other week. We're going to try to do, but give us a little bit to get up there. We got some moving we got to do. But we will see you all in the summer. And thank you again, Mericel. And take care, everyone.
Thank you all so much again.
Thank you.
Thank you.